Good morning, everyone. I think we will make a start. We often have a bit of an influx a minute after we're due to start, but let's kick off. My name is Rebecca Burden. I'm the Managing Director here at the Energy Transition Hub. Thank you all very much for coming today, and welcome to everybody who's attending by webinar. We'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we work and meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and paying our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We'd also like to acknowledge the Victorian Clean Technology Fund, who is sponsoring this talk as part of a series on clean technology and emerging trends. They've been a great partner in this, and we're here today to hear from Jane Hyder, a partner at Cause Chambers Westgarth, who has very kindly come down to talk to us about the emerging trend in renewable energy in Australia, and particularly related to aggregation and all of its many forms. So site aggregation, purchaser aggregation, microgrids and other things, and give us her insights on some of the regulatory challenges and barriers that have emerged, in particular in relation to recent projects. It's fantastic to have Jane here. It's a really great insight into some of the practical things that emerge when you're actually trying to get these projects up and running. And looking at some of these regulatory issues is, of course, part of our research, but it's a rare opportunity to hear how they have been dealt with and the ones which have been the biggest issues in practice as opposed to just in principle. Jane has had over 20 years experience working in infrastructure and construction projects, including a great deal of experience in renewable energy. She's advised government agencies on their procurement processes and the structure of their arrangements, including in relation to procuring renewable energy projects, and has also worked for developers and contractors in particular, and really everybody who's worked on different sides of getting renewable energy projects up. So Jane, welcome, and we'll have some questions at the end, both from the floor and from those on webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. All right, this is a bit interesting, isn't it? Thanks for having me today. I'll just go back and keep that as a surprise. I should say at the outset that I have, I've done some very high-level slides, and I also have a paper that I'm going to speak to this morning. I thought it was, I don't usually do things that way, but this is the way I'm going to do it today. I will be happy to circulate this for anyone who is interested. It's got a reasonable amount of detail in it. It's not footnoted, so it's not 100% perfect, but it'll provide a little bit more written down information if that's something that interests you. I should start with a qualification, which is to say I am just a lawyer and I'm not an expert in technical energy things. And one of the very challenging aspects of this area, I was just talking to Rebecca and Annabelle about, is that there is so much change and there are so many stakeholders and regulators working on different bits and pieces that you have to keep constantly Googling. And even just this morning I was Googling some of the things that I'm talking about today and I was like, oh my God, it's changed again. I'm going to be wrong. So that's a bit of a caveat, but hopefully what I can share with you this morning is some of the issues that I am seeing and provide some constructive commentary on the challenges. And I should also add a further caveat, which is that it's mostly based on my experience here in Victoria. As you would all be aware, we have a fantastic federal system, which means that there is a different, sometimes only slightly different, in other cases very different, regulatory regime that applies to energy network service supply, retailers and generators, all up and down the eastern seaboard in the NEM basically, and then we also have the other states. It's great for lawyers. We get to provide reports on all the different regulatory impacts for this one thing that a client might want to do, and I say, oh, well, I'll have to give you 8 different answers. It's one of my pet hates as a lawyer, the challenges with the federal system, because it creates a lot of inefficiencies, but that's another thing. So when Rebecca and I first started talking, what I said I would talk about is all the regulatory barriers to renewable energy development in Australia. And then I thought, that's a pretty massive topic, and it's also a pretty negative topic, and it might reinforce your predetermined views about lawyers. So I'm not going to do that. And I also want to point out that there's no one solution to some of the challenges we see, and there is only so much that I can cover in the time allowed. I should say there's a vast, I want to talk about the purpose of a regulatory framework a bit and point out that there is a huge amount of work that is being done on creating a framework which is fit for purpose for the new and alternative forms of renewable energy. It's very easy for me or for anyone to sit and say, oh, that doesn't work or that doesn't work. Nothing will ever be perfect, but the purpose of some of the comments I make today is to highlight some of the challenges that we're seeing in a practical day-to-day sense. I think everyone agrees that a framework should be flexible, but baking that flexibility into a highly regulated environment is actually incredibly challenging. A further challenge is and you see this a lot also in the area of data and IT, is that it's a rapidly moving area, renewable energy. There's lots of technical advances that are being made. There are lots and lots of people out there in the private sector working on really interesting models and delivery systems and different kinds of businesses. So that creates a massive challenge. I want to start therefore with a very simple example. I think I can go forward now. No, I can't. Okay, so about 18 months ago, I was advising a very large property developer who wanted to do something quite simple. What they wanted to do was install rooftop solar on its office buildings. The solar was going to be installed by a related entity which had been established solely for the purpose of doing this. They put solar on the various commercial buildings up and down the eastern seaboard, and the energy that was generated would go into base building energy only. So we're not talking embedded network or anything like that. Our task was to advise our client on the regulatory requirements of the proposal in Queensland, Victoria and New South Wales. This meant 3 sets of advice, as I've mentioned earlier. And it quickly became apparent, however, that the existing solar PPA exemption under the General Exemption Order, which is the order we have in Victoria made under the Electricity Industry Act, which governs particular activities and whether you need to be registered or licensed or whether you can be exempt from that kind of arrangement. So looking at that exemption, it became apparent that the solar PPA exemption wouldn't work for our client. And that was because the exemption only applied to installations performed by an owner or occupier of a premise. In this model, and therefore the exemption did not envisage that a provider of the energy could be occupying just one part of a premises, which was what we wanted to do. And obviously that's what happens when you take a lease of roof space. You're only occupying a part of the premises. And rooftop solar is increasingly structured this way. So I make this point not to criticise the Essential Services Commission. And to their credit, after I spoke to them, they've actually addressed this issue in the new GEO, which was issued in 2017, specifically addressed it. So it's not about criticising the ESC, but to make the point that if you have a system where exemptions to registration and licensing are systematically carved out by reference to particular models, it's inevitable that some models will not fit. And that's what happened to my client. So to then come to aggregation, what do I mean by this? I actually had 5, and then I thought, oh, it's too many. So there was another kind that I'd thought of addressing, but I'm just going to talk about 4. And I'll focus mostly, I think, on the microgrid issue, which I think is a very movable feast at the moment. And I'll talk briefly about 1 and 2, and then about 4, which is in connection with a couple of projects that I've had some involvement in. So there are 4 types of aggregation. The first is where you have aggregation of more than one site to produce renewable energy and which are connected to the grid. Second is where you have more than one function on one site. Third example is where you have a group of electricity sources which can generate and share energy and may or may not be islanded by disconnection from the grid. That's what we usually call a microgrid or a SAPS. And the fourth example is aggregation of purchases. And we're seeing this a lot in across government councils in particular, and other government agencies and large corporates are doing quite a bit of work in this space. The question I want to post is whether our current regulatory environment is sufficiently flexible to enable the development and growth of these models. I think that this question is important because I believe that these kinds of aggregation models are going to become more and more common, not less common. So the federal opposition, still the federal opposition, recognised this, and part of its policy in the renewable energy space included the following: establishment of community power hubs to support the development of projects in local communities, such as solar gardens on apartment rooftops, community wind farms, and energy efficiency upgrades for social housing. Of course, the ALP's ideas won't be implemented at the federal level, and not everything in a community hub involves aggregation, but conceptually, the idea of people coming together and buying things together, or premises or sites coming together and pooling their energy resources, is an idea which has got a lot of traction on that side of politics. There is a Victorian government policy around community hubs, and at the moment, what they mostly involve, as far as I can see, is bulk buying and other smaller projects which happen to involve a community. So I want to have a look very quickly at the theory and the rationale for the regulation, and then look at some of the constraints and then some of the specific aggregation examples. So participants who want to set up a particular business model will go to talk to a lawyer and a technical consultant, and they will be looking firstly to see if any of the exemptions will apply to what they want to do. In some cases, it might be totally appropriate that they obtain a license, particularly if they're a very large player, and that's what they will sometimes do. So I'm talking about something that is slightly more small scale, where the question that needs to be asked is whether it's appropriate for those entities to be licensed, or whether some kind of exemption regime should apply. One of the challenges with exemptions is that it becomes very hard to track who's exempt, what's happening in the market, and it's been recognised by the regulators that in most cases, even if there are exempt, the AER runs this system now, and we have it in Victoria, that you might be exempt, but you've still got to register so that at least the activity can be tracked, and so we can get a proper idea about exactly what's going on in the market. So the challenge for the regulators and governments is to evolve what is called a future-ready regulatory framework. And to quote Energy Networks Australia there, talking about economic regulation, which I'm not discussing today, ring-fencing obligations, licensing requirements, can of course profoundly affect the capacity for commercial firms to participate and enter these markets, the type of services they can offer, permissible pricing structures and levels, incentives for, and the scope of innovation and feasible business models. So we see this all the time with new entrants to the Australian market, particularly the French and Spanish. They come in and they say, we've got this brilliant idea, we want to do this, we want to do this. And sometimes we have to say, you can't. And they don't like that and they don't understand. The AER says that a compliance framework needs to facilitate new entry to electricity demand management market to stimulate competition, ensure that residential and small business consumers are effectively protected, and that's critical, and ensure that barriers to entry are not created by requiring new entrants to meet onerous and unnecessary compliance and accreditation requirements. The AER says that its approach is sufficiently flexible to deal with microgrids, aggregated generation, community-owned energy, and so on and so forth. In very general terms, the regulatory constraints, i.e. the obligation to obtain a kind of authorisation or licence or to get an exemption, will kick in for any model that straddles more than one site. So the AER's last statement of approach to regulation of alternative energy sellers confirmed this by saying the following factors will justify certain kinds of authorisation: if the seller is the primary source of energy to a small customer, and if the seller sells across multiple sites. So I want to look a little bit at the multiple site issue, because I think that that is providing a little bit of a break on things at the moment. So if we look at the Victorian framework, which, as I've mentioned, was revised in 2007, which is now largely aligned with the AER's regulatory framework, which applies in other states. So they have various deemed retail exemptions that apply in relation to intermediary sale and network services. And there's this concept of over and under 10 customers, and there are various little tests that are applied. But the point I want to make is that the constraint or the right to obtain an exemption only exists if the sale is within the limits of a site. We then have an exemption for retirement villages, caravan parks, holiday parks, residential land lease parks, and manufactured home estates. Not 100% sure what that last is. And then we have what we call a multiple activity exemption. And that was previously called the solar PPA exemption, which I mentioned earlier. So the ESC's final position paper said that this was intended to exempt small-scale generation activities and to address certain new developments in the market, such as community energy projects and solar PPAs. As you can see here, Clause 17 of the GEO requires the relevant person to carry out the following activities: generating or distributing electricity on premises not owned, and supplying and selling the electricity to the owner or occupier of the premises or a licensed retailer. And any output not sold to the customer has to be sold into the grid. So as is evident from the above, that also contains a site constraint. So my earlier example given of my client, the property developer, this exemption now works for it because it has a concept of a portion of the premises. So if they're leasing the roof space, it will work out, but they can only supply energy to that particular building. So in relation to these site constraints, it has been acknowledged that for community solar, for example, the exemptions will operate only where there is one site. Where the multiple activities cross individual properties and public land, what the ESC said that it would do is adopt a wait and see approach. So I thought we could look at some of the models and options that might be available and what I'm seeing in the market whilst the wait and see approach is being adopted. So site aggregation. Under this model, you will have more than one site being the recipient of energy supply, which might be located on another site, or there might be renewable energy infrastructure located on both sites. So if it might seem very specific, but it actually happens quite a lot. You'll have property owners that own adjacent, just right next to me at Cause. There is a very large listed developer that owns VCAT, and it also owns the building next door that it's about to demolish and build something else. So in that situation, they might want to provide energy interchangeably or set up some kind of infrastructure that will enable the sharing. And at the moment, it would not be able to do that under the exemption regime because it's limited to site-specific activities. I've also done quite a lot of work for community solar organisations, and this is a very broad heading, of course, and it covers a wide spectrum of different models. Sometimes when we refer to community solar, we're just talking about group investment in a utility scale solar project, or it might talk about some kind of community fundraising or crowdfunding, or it might be referring to a very specific project where the community solar organisation will install some solar infrastructure on a council building. So that's a more typical version of community solar, and that is clearly enabled by the regulatory environment. But as I've alluded to earlier, anything more complex, and when I say more complex, I mean installing infrastructure on two buildings that are on different sites would not be enabled by the exemption framework and would require a license and registration as a generator, depending on size, and potentially as a retailer. So that's quite a big a number of CSOs view that, not all of them, because they might be operating in a different space, but that is viewed by some CSOs as an impediment to the growth that they really want to be able to see in that area. All right, the next type of aggregation, moving away from aggregation of sites, is to an aggregation of functions on one site. In Australia, very large country, there's quite a large country with a lot of unusable land, but we still view it as being a large country with lots of space. There's an interesting debate about how land should be used, and that comes into play sometimes when land which is of very high value, which could be used for agricultural purposes, is in fact purchased by someone and set aside for renewable energy development. And you can see in some cases there have been some quite nasty disputes between all the relevant stakeholders about the use of the land. There is, of course, an alternative that assumes that the land is used either for agriculture or for renewable energy infrastructure. There is an alternative approach, and there are not heaps and heaps and heaps, but there are examples in Europe of wind farms coexisting with plantation forests. And there are examples of solar panels being installed on certain types of agricultural land. So just looking at that in a bit more detail, you may have heard about Delburn Wind Farm, which is a 300 megawatt project which is proposed for the Latrobe Valley. And that would be developed in an existing plantation forest. It utilises much taller turbine towers than standard, so it goes way, 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 way up above the trees and maybe up higher than the birds. But the point is that because of its location, it would be able to access existing infrastructure, roads, and the grid connection. And what we are seeing, I'm seeing in a number of projects, particularly in the west of Victoria at the moment, is that grid connection is very challenged and there are very significant delays. So if you can get a project up and running that's already, you don't have to build a road, you don't have to worry about your grid connection, you are really starting off at a major advantage. It does, however, need to overcome planning and environmental regulations. The usual constraints will apply about whether you can build a wind farm, and as we know in Victoria, that is an activity that's been quite tightly regulated in many different ways over the last 10 or so years. Macedon Ranges Sustainability Group, which is a really interesting community renewable energy organisation, has lots of different projects it's working on, and it has, I haven't been able to find out much information about this actually, but it is apparently developing a wind farm in a pine plantation. And the challenges faced there are perhaps evident by the fact that it's been working on that project for really a very long time, years and years and years. Moving on to solar in combination with agriculture, there is a well-known French business that has entered the market here about a year and a bit ago, and it has quite an advanced model which it calls Agri-Energy, in which solar panels are installed in and around suitable crops, and the money saved from the energy generation can then be used in a number of ways, but it can obviously assist the landowners with farm improvements and things like that. And also if you're using a lot of energy, so it reduces your energy costs. I think it's a personal opinion, but perhaps in Australia our approach to land has been informed by the fact that we don't have the scarcity that you see in Europe by reference to population numbers. And we feel there's always been plenty to go around. I think this attitude is off topic, but this attitude has impacted our approach to waste management, which I was just discussing with Rebecca. It's worth noting that in Australia, only one large utility scale energy from waste facility has reached financial close, whereas in the Netherlands, which has got a slightly smaller population than Australia, there are more than 12. So I think that these are very, very interesting, pretty cutting edge projects, and conceptually it's important to note that our planning system does not prevent two uses for one piece of land, and there are many, many examples that you can look around to see where land is being used in a number of different ways. But I think it will conceptually challenge planning authorities, potentially, and it's possible that a very large project like the Delburn wind farm would find that it would ultimately need to potentially get ministerial approval because of the challenges, the unusual nature, if you like, of the project. That creates a bit of a barrier for those people, but they are getting on with it, and it will be really interesting to see what happens. I should say what's going on in the Latrobe Valley is actually incredibly interesting. The effort that the Victorian government has put into generating renewable energy projects, a number of different ones, including microgrids, segue, has been really fantastic to see. So coming on to microgrids, as you would all know, they're a standalone power system that generates and supplies electricity to multiple customers. This could be anything. In Australia, this ranges from microgrids that actually are disconnected from the grid and supply an entire town, to just a couple of farms that are connected to each other. And the power can be delivered in a number of different ways. It could be a mix of local generation and storage, behind the meter generation and storage, and pretty obviously it's very suitable in Australia for remote communities, island resorts, remote mining towns, and so on. I've taken from the internet a diagram of the King Island Renewable Energy Integration Project. Now, King Island is in Bass Strait, and one thing that's very interesting in regulatory terms is that they have their own standalone energy regulation. So there are not the regulatory barriers that there otherwise might be to the implementation of this microgrid. Another example that is quite well known is Carnarvon, which is 900 kilometres north of Perth, and it has a service area of about 300 square kilometres, and power is supplied to 6,500 customers connected to a network of 520 kilometres of power lines and 8,600 power poles. So that's a really significant microgrid. Another recent example, I'll just leave that up, is on Garden Island in WA, where Western Power with Carnegie Wave Energy and Arena are going to trial a really actually interesting combination of different kinds of renewable energy. It's the first microgrid project in the world which will combine wave energy, solar, a desalination plant, and energy storage. And the key advantage with Garden Island is that they've got an inbuilt, already there, customer being the Department of Defence. So there's some really large-scale examples of microgrids, and in many cases they're enabled by the legislation or the regulatory environment. But let's take perhaps a more local example. Some businesses are working on microgrids which are just a collection of apartment buildings, and they will install various facilities and seek to share their electricity. There are advances in software, I won't name the commercial businesses, but there's quite a number out there that mean, well, at least two I know of, that it may be possible for customers to opt in and opt out of their energy take at any given point in time. The Victorian government is piloting a number of microgrids, and worth noting is a project being run in the Latrobe Valley in which there are 3 different types of buildings which will access and share renewable energy resources. So based on the current Victorian regulations, there are at least 3 issues with this kind of microgrid model. And I say this because in Victoria, there isn't actually a specific framework designed for microgrids. So if you're just doing it on one property, it will be fine. But if the activity is cross-site, you've got 3 buildings and they're going to share together, that's potentially a problem. If the power is not only going to be sold to residents of the relevant premises, that's potentially a problem. And then there are a whole lot of appropriate consumer protections in the general exemption order relating to how the sale is documented to ensure that consumers get the relevant amount of protection. And if you have that kind of innovative software in operation, it is possible that the electricity provided may not be for an agreed price and for an agreed period. So I thought it would be worth looking at a pretty easy solution to this, which is the South Australian legislation. I can't remember whether it's a regulation or actually in the Act. But in any event, there is a specific set of exemptions from licensing requirements, which I've listed there, and I will not read them out. But in effect, that would enable a microgrid to obtain an exemption. Another way to look at it is to say that there's an obvious analogy with embedded network managers, and there is a regulatory framework in all states dealing with embedded network managers, and could that be extended to specifically apply to microgrid operators? I should note that the AEMC is due to report on regulation of standalone power systems in June this year. So possibly a solution will be offered, and a lot of, as I said before, there's a lot of microgrids that have been in operation for a very long time, or new, very small ones. And I'm seeing more and more of the smaller coming through, and they're mostly being done as pilot projects at the moment, at least in Victoria, and there does need to be some kind of regime to enable more and more to be able to operate. There are also a couple of towns, as Newstead, that Powercall was operating. They set that up a few years ago now as a pilot on a standalone separate microgrid basis. So there's quite a few examples floating around. So moving to something that's a little bit conceptually different is purchaser aggregation. I think this is particularly important in Australia because you quite often don't have the scale of energy requirements to get larger projects off the ground. And we would have all read about Google and Facebook and those really massive energy users in the US and the deals that they've done to, in effect, fund large utility scale projects. And that is because they have huge energy demand. We don't necessarily, there are quite a few businesses that do very energy dense, but we don't necessarily have that as much in Australia. And so we are seeing a lot of instances where groups of purchasers are teaming up to reach an agreement pursuant to which they in effect support via a PPA in the form of whatever, contract for difference or something else, to enable the funding of a utility scale project. The two examples, I'll just skip down to MREP. MREP is the Melbourne Renewable Energy Project, which was run by Melbourne City Council, which has been a very, very active participant in the renewable energy area. They've produced, I should say, an absolutely fantastic guide to how to deliver this kind of project. So they've got some really enthusiastic, clever, smart people on the job. I should say this project took quite a while to get off the ground. They went out to market, and then I wasn't involved in that first stage, but they then had to, there was some kind of delay, and I'm not quite sure what the explanation was. Might have been a market issue. There are 14 corporates and government agencies involved in the aggregation for this project. That include, we advised, my firm, 3-4 of these participants, and they included Zoos Victoria, National Australia Bank, Australia Post, City of Yarra, a number of different quite a good mix of participants with quite interesting energy uses. The zoos are a fantastic example. They have unusual energy requirements. They have a need to, for example, often your energy use will go down at night, but they have to heat their hippo pool 24 hours a day. So they've got interesting energy requirements. So the idea behind this model is that the 14 participants all agreed on how much energy they would need, and they did that via an MOU or some kind of participants agreement. And then they each entered into an arrangement with the successful bidder, which was Pacific Hydro, who was proposing to develop a wind farm at, I'm not quite, Crowlands or Crowlands, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that. The process was facilitated, managed and run by Melbourne City Council, and they managed to come up with a structure that actually accommodated different participant requirements in terms of, LGC, whether they would be surrendered or sold or whatever. There was, however, a need for all of the participants to reach alignment in terms of their objectives and requirements, and I infer that that was presented some challenges because they're quite a diverse group of entities. There's another interesting grouping called the Renewable Energy Buyers Forum, which is run in part by the WWF, and their purpose is to bring together purchasers who might be interested in supporting renewable energy, and they're working on some pretty interesting projects in this space. Another example, which I was involved in Moree when it was being built, but I haven't had any involvement in this project, is the Southern Sydney Regional Organisation of Councils, and that was 18 councils who managed to get together and reach agreement on sourcing 35% of their electricity via Moree solar farm, and the balance of their energy requirements will be provided by the power purchase agreement counterparty, which is the local retailer, which is Origin. So this is quite a different issue conceptually. The challenges here are not regulatory or legislative, they are commercial. And the MREP project have identified a number of challenges in implementing the project, leaving aside the market issues. The obvious one, which I've mentioned, is getting the 14 participants to agree on their requirements. And there are lots of different internal approvals and processes that needed to be worked through by these organisations, which probably also added to the time frame that it took. Oh, that's worth mentioning. I really believe that one of the reasons that MREP managed to get over the line was because Pacific Hydro has its own retailer entity, Tango, and I think it made it a lot easier for the ultimate deal for the generator and retailer to be in effect related entities. I think it just made the whole process smoother rather than having to drag in a third-party retailer. So, the way forward. As I hope I've made clear, I think that aggregation in its different manifestations is a theme which is going to continue to grow in Australia. Sometimes it's necessary to create sufficient scale or buying power. In other cases, it's necessary to put a renewable facility on land being used for other purposes to enable access to existing infrastructure such as road and grid connections. And although that type of aggregation is very embryonic, I really believe that because grid connection is so challenged at the moment and because of the cost of putting in the roads and so on that you otherwise need, that's going to become something that people will really be focusing on. So there's no simple solution. One place to start might be to consider, and there are probably challenges and arguments against this, but I think it is worth thinking about expanding the premises exemptions that I looked at earlier to more than one site. It could just be limited to adjacent sites or sites within a geographic area, but I think that would free up people to start looking at perhaps more interesting models. And I say this, of course, without canvassing the impact on the grid and looking at all those kinds of other issues that arise in this context. In the case of microgrids, there are a couple of existing examples of regulatory regimes. There's a regime in Queensland that I haven't mentioned, but there is the one I have mentioned in South Australia, which could be adapted to enable those to be developed a little bit more readily. There will continue to be many challenges in developing a framework. and the consumer must continue to be protected, and the projects have to be tracked and recorded. That's really important. Most of all, the system needs to be alert to new models and respond appropriately, as these models are continuing to be tested and implemented by business and community bodies. And what you don't want to see is the delta getting so wide that the private sector is just kind of going it alone, which we're kind of seeing a little bit in the renewable energy space generally because of the well-documented policy issues at federal level over the last 10 years. And you see that private sector is driving a lot of this. And I think if you have a regulatory regime that isn't sufficiently agile or flexible, there'll be a separation, and then it starts to become very hard to catch up. And that is all I had to say. Oh, actually, I have something else to say. Upcoming seminars.
Great, we will remind you about those again at the end. Thank you so much, Jane. I've got a million questions of my own, having listened to you, but let's start with taking some questions from the floor. If there are any questions here, or there's one on webinar. Okay, let's do that first.
Thank you. That was fantastic, Jane. One here from Sebastian Klein. To what extent is there an opportunity for community groups to work with existing retailers, registered energy brokers, or otherwise exempt groups, for example, embedded network operators, to aggregate sites?
I think that's, yes. Leaving aside the fact that you can't aggregate sites, I think that, well, actually, let me think about that. If you're working with a retailer, you don't have the problem, because it's important to recognise that the premise of part of my comments about the regulatory system is that these are people that are looking to take advantage of the exemption. If you develop a model where you have a retailer, I mean, it's probably a bit hard to articulate without drawing, I like to draw these things, but you have a retailer who already has all the relevant registrations, then you can and licenses, you can come up with a model where you don't need a retail exemption because you've already got a retailer under your umbrella. I know that a lot of the community groups are doing good work with retailers. It's often very small scale, and sometimes some of the retailers are not, they don't see it as part of what they do. It's just a bit small fry for them. So it really depends a lot. But yes, and it's probably not the best answer, but if you can get those registered people in your tent, it does make life a little bit easier to some extent.
Thanks. My name is Marka. Just had a quick question or comment. Do you think the regulator needs to redefine the current framework, or design a new model that fits and enables the transition rather than patching and just coming up with all these side solutions that will see probably the whole model and framework sort of collapse after some time?
Yes, I think that I mean, the tendency of a regulator, and you see this legislation, that they have their framework, and then as things arise, they say, oh, we'll just carve that out, and then we'll carve that out, and we'll come up with that exemption. And it tends to be a very reactive process. And I'm not criticising the regulators, because I think they do their best to try and be in touch with what is going on in the market. Conceptually, there are quite a few arguments in favour of starting again in a number of respects, because you are in a space, perhaps I'll just use the general exemption order as a specific example. So that was issued in 2017, and I've already mentioned that it addressed the concern of my particular client with their particular model. But there are already examples that I have given today and that I could give otherwise, where that people are trying to implement that general exemption order doesn't address. So the ESC might say, well, the way to address that is we'll just redo our general exemption order and we'll put in some more exemptions. Now, their redoing of that order and that whole process took a couple of years, and I just don't think it's a particularly agile tool. It's not as if you can, because in fairness to them, they have to consult, they do their discussion paper, they get the consultation, and they do an interim paper and then they do a final paper. So it's not as if, you know, if I was running the world, I'd just go, we'll just do it tomorrow, but you can't do that. So it starts to become super clunky. And by the time they've implemented their further carve-outs and patchwork, patch-ups, they are already behind the 8 ball. So it would be great to start again. And I think there are some pretty good arguments being made in many other spaces for that to happen, but whether there's the appetite, it's pretty tricky when you think about how it all fits together across the NEM.
Thank you, Jane. My name's Rowan. Great talk. I'm interested in the difference between the regulations around and the aggregation from an energy perspective versus the aggregation from a grid support perspective and all of the parts of that.
Yeah.
In most of your talk, it sounded as though you were talking about the aggregation from an energy perspective.
Yeah.
And I think this also touches to what you were addressing in the previous question. All of the regulators and the myriad of regulators, the bulk of what they're trying to do is actually the non-energy problem. And that's, I suspect, part of the reason why we've got this patchwork, because the financial incentives are mainly around the energy side, which in some ways is the easy part.
Yeah, yep. I agree. I agree with you. And it's such an incredibly complex area that you, for every solution you posit, there's very good arguments about why that's not a good solution, and then everything, it's all so interconnected and impacts it. Yes. So yes. I don't have anything to add apart that you're right. Yeah.
Joe, are you able to ask your question?
Yeah, happy to. It's Joe Unane from the Victorian Clean Technology Fund. Can you hear me?
Yep.
So my question was almost the opposite of aggregation. There's quite a lot happening particularly with emerging software, which facilitates peer-to-peer energy transactions. Somebody with a solar panel and somebody else with a pool pump, unrelated entities to transact energy. Do you feel? I mean, what are your thoughts about the impact of those emerging types of transactions on the imperative or the impetus for aggregation?
Well, a specific thought is that on one view, it's quite interesting because if using that software, you're still in theory crossing sites when you sell. But I think what you're saying is it will make, you won't need to physically aggregate because you'll be able to just share virtually. Is that what
Yeah, that's right. And the transactions are ad hoc and very small typically, not aggregated in any kind of bulk buying or community sense.
I think it's a separate and opposite stream that I don't know a huge amount about it, but I agree that it in one sense is kind of the opposite to an aggregation trend. But I think we'll see both, because they're slightly, they might have different functions and purposes, and it will depend on, I can see it in the microgrid concept actually being used very extensively. I'm not sure I have a very good feel for how advanced that technology is. I think there was that what GreenSync were talking about last week?
That's right, whenever it was, a couple of weeks ago. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's that kind of model. So yes, we'll have an impact.
Okay, thanks.
I have another online. Jerome, are you able to ask your question? Jerome Rowcroft? I can ask on behalf. A lot has focused on community groups, but a big problem has been that utility scale developers haven't been able to work together. So in Southwest Victoria, the community don't mind so much the wind farms, but they are really angry about all the new transmission lines. Are there any models that exist that might allow developers to share infrastructure? I see challenges around projects having different timelines and each connection needing to be analysed independently.
Well, that's happening. I'm just trying to think if this is publicly known. It must be. It must be. One of the wind farms that was successful in the reverse auction, and I can't remember which one it was because it wasn't one of the ones I advised on, is quite close to another wind farm that was slightly ahead in terms of its planning. And there was an issue there about the transmission infrastructure and who would pay for it and how it would be utilised. And I totally agree that there should be, I mean, I think in fairness to AusNet, they do try to coordinate. I don't think you're getting I think the question's not so much about having two sets of transmission lines next to each other, but it's about getting an appropriately coordinated plan in place so that the relevant and appropriate contribution can be made at the right time. And it's an issue.
So, is it the same problem with the railway lines up at the iron ore places?
Yes.
Up in the Kimberleys, exactly.
Yep.
And that High Court decision on that,
yep.
That verified the private ownership of the railway line. And it's exactly the same.
Yeah, well, there are pretty complex, and I haven't ventured into that area at all today, issues about third-party access and the way that's all regulated in energy. And I don't have a huge amount of, I couldn't claim to be an expert in that area, but it is certainly, and it's a bit similar to telecoms is another analogy with, you know, having double sets of telecoms fibre optic cable in the ground because they're not sharing or they haven't built them with enough capacity and there is no proper connection between all the relevant stakeholders. So that's a task for someone, and I'm certain you would find that there's a paper on it.
The reason I raised that High Court case is it's only going to happen with legislative change.
Yeah, probably. Yeah,
you know, because
to force.
You know,
yeah.
it basically maintained an old view of property law.
Yeah.
And if you've got an old view of property law, there's too many vested interests to keep it as it is and do nothing. Yeah,
you won't drive the change because people won't. Yeah, people will be self-serving. Yes.
Another online question, if that's okay.
Val, go for it.
Do you have any examples of microgrids in residential areas, that is small micrograms within larger residential areas? Sorry, this is from Robert McLean. And secondly, are the people ahead of the governments on this issue?
I don't have specific examples except about the pilots that are publicly available. So the question is about smaller within a larger area. I understand that there are people that are trying, well, in Victoria, it's not really enabled, so there are the pilots. In other states, there are some examples that I have read about. What was the second question?
Are the people ahead of the governments on this issue?
Well, yes. I think, you know, in fairness to again, this is a Victorian focus, but the Victorian government is trying to enable, it's rational to say, well, we see the interest, let's fund a pilot. And I'm not for a minute suggesting you can't do a pilot unless you have all the legislation and regulation in place, because it's about testing to see if it works. And so I applaud them for having a go. But yeah, I think in some instances you'd say the people are ahead.
Jane, a different question from what I was asking before. You talked about the MREP process and for buying energy by large organisations together. What was the advantage from your point of view, or to how large was the advantage in going down that sort of joint buyers group approach, as opposed to large individual corporates going to a pack hydro directly, or a flow power, or one of the others who's doing good stuff in those sorts of spaces. So how much and what was the difference overall?
Well, I didn't advise Melbourne City Council on this, so I'm not sure why they originally started with the idea of aggregating their purchases, but I assume it was because their energy needs were not enough to justify a utility scale project, whereas if you look at like a Google, they can support a 80 megawatt in Silicon Valley somewhere. I don't know if they came up with the idea as a way of testing to see if it would work, whether it was kind of conceptually or ideologically driven, because of course, when you look at the participants, Australia Post, so it's what it's buying is only a very small portion of its actual energy needs. I think it related to 3 or 4 buildings or something like that. So no one is getting all of their energy from this model. And I don't think there is any particular advantage between either model. I personally think it would be easier legally to just be the one buyer. If you, I haven't mentioned, but if you have an aggregated set of buyers like this, you will generally need to get some kind of clearance or authorisation from the ACCC. So, because there's a potential argument that it's some kind of which is what MREP did. They got that clearance. So that's just the beginning. So there are many more commercial and legal challenges when you're ganging together to buy energy on that basis.
That's very interesting. We're getting close to time, but can I just, I think we've got enough time for me to ask one last question. You mentioned the South Australian model to facilitate microgrids, which looks extremely sensible at first blush. Do you think, what's your view on the likelihood that other states will go down that route as opposed to trying to write exemptions to that accommodate very specific cases? The South Australian seems more like, if you have any of these characteristics, you're fine.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know whether you could just shove the South Australian exemptions into the existing Victorian framework, because there would be conflicts and it wouldn't work. I got that example because I didn't know about it from the preliminary report that the AEMC is going to finalise in June. So that might end up being their recommendation, and I can't see that it would do any harm. Queensland has a different approach to microgrids. They have some kind of Ergon Energy can, I think, register microgrids. They've got a slightly different approach that might be a function of the size of Queensland and the historical and geographic need to have microgrids. So it's a bit of a wait and see thing, I think. But again, if you list out characteristics, they would need to be very broad to make sure that they met all of the different models that you have. But my understanding is that the South Australian approach, I think it's legislation, has been there for, it's not new, so it's worked for them.
Thank you so much. Oh, Jane, there's one more.
There is one more. Is that all right?
Yeah, of course.
One more question.
Absolutely.
Another one from Sebastian Klein. Does participation in purchaser aggregation, for example, the MREP, necessarily exclude the possibility of entities utilising their own energy resource assets in energy and ancillary services markets? Or is this subject to negotiation and terms of specific agreements?
No, because it was a contract for difference, and so they, for a start, were not buying their entire energy needs, and in any event, they're supplementing it with their. So no, the answer is no. I mean, PPA is a whole other topic that would easily take up an hour to talk about the different PPA models that are being used, and that's another trend. Yes.
Okay, thank you so much, Jane. That was really fascinating, and it's really great to have this perspective as part of the discussion here at the Hub. So please join me all in thanking Jane. And
Sorry, just quickly, we also have some upcoming seminars. No worries. So Tiffany Harrison, who's an Executive Officer for Climate Emergency Darebin, will be talking on a panel that is being hosted, co-hosted by Beyond Zero Emissions, that we held at the Fritz Lowe Theatre on Monday, the 3rd of June at 6:30 p.m. And we also have Rochelle Meyer, Dr. Rochelle Meyer, who's a PhD candidate, successful PhD candidate from the college, talking about achieving net negative emissions in a productive agricultural sector next Wednesday, 5th of June at 11 a.m. You're more than welcome to attend. Thank you.